Welcome to this module. In this course, up until now, we talked about CSS, which I guess makes sense if you consider the course title. Now in this module, we'll have a look at Sass though. Sass, as you will learn, is a superset to CSS, so basically a language based on CSS, which is not understood by the browser. We'll still make it work and I will show you how it works. I'll of course also explain why using Sass over CSS could be beneficial and how it still relates to CSS. So let's dive right into this, let's find out what Sass is, let's install it and let's work with it. So what is Sass? And here I just wrote it a bit differently, you can use both notations, and I also noted SCSS in the title. Now Sass and SCSS are essentially the same, their syntax varies slightly and I will explain what the difference is and how their syntax differs in a second. But first of all, let's find out what it is in general. What is this Sass SCSS thing about? Well, we obviously got CSS. That is what you learned in this course and no worries, what you learned still is valid. Sass builds up on it, it doesn't introduce new rules, it doesn't render your CSS knowledge you got in this course useless. Instead, Sass stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. And Sass, as I already mentioned, does not run in the browser. Instead, it extends CSS during development only. Now, what does this mean? You can think of it like this. During development, you as a developer, you want to save time and you want to write clean, reusable code that's easy to maintain and to adjust. With CSS, you can quickly end up with huge CSS files with dozens, hundreds, or thousands of rules. Now, managing this can be cumbersome. And you also find yourself repeating certain things a lot. So it would be nice if you had a more condensed, easier syntax. Maybe something that allows you to nest CSS selectors into each other, for example. And Sass simply offers such features. And in this module, you'll of course learn about all the important Sass features and I will show you in a real example how it would work. The important thing is of course that you can only use it during development. So it needs to be compiled to normal CSS before you can ship it to production because the browser doesn't understand Sass. So the idea is that you as a developer can write Sass SCSS code and then you let some tool compile it to normal CSS. And that's exactly what we will start with in this module thereafter. Once we're done with these slides, we will install that tool and we will find out how it works and what it actually does for us. Now, before we dive into the tool, let's quickly have a look at the Sass features we got. There are a lot of features and I will walk you through the important ones here in this module. What we can generally do with Sass is we can nest CSS rules to shorten our code. We can inherit from other rules so that we don't have to repeat ourselves as often. We can use helper functions to achieve certain things like making a color a bit more brighter or things like that. We can add mix-ins to create reusable snippets of code, you could say, and I will show you how this works. We can split our code into multiple files easily with partials. We can define variables. Let's say if a certain hex code of a color gets used a couple of times on our page, instead of writing that hex code every time and changing it whenever we change the color, we can simply store it in a variable and use that variable. And we can also use conditions and loops and a couple of other features. Again, you will see them in practice in this module. So with that, let's move towards the practice and let's actually install that tool that will compile our Sass code to CSS code. The place to start is on sasslang.com. sass-lang.com. That's the page of the Sass language if you want to call it like this, and there you can get started with Sass. There, by the way, you can also find a documentation where you can dive in much deeper and learn way more about Sass if you want to do so, but again, I will walk you through the core features here. So for now, let's simply click on Learn Sass here, and there you can find out more about how it works, and you also see the command you need to run to compile a SCSS file in this case to a CSS file, which again you need to do to ship it. Now in order to compile it, you need to install it. And for that, you can click on that Go Here link on that Learn Sass page to learn how to set your machine up for Sass development. Now there you can find that there are a couple of tools you could install, but we will use the command line. And for the command line, we can install a certain tool we can execute there to compile our files. Now for Windows, you will need to install Ruby first. And you can simply follow that link to the Ruby installer here on the Sass page to simply download and install Ruby. Now, we won't write any Ruby code. Sass just is a Ruby gem, so a tool built with Ruby, you could say, and therefore it requires the Ruby runtime to, well, work. So make sure to download and install that Ruby installer on Windows. On Mac, this is not required because you already start with Ruby installed. So once that is done, we can continue with these steps here, both on Windows and Mac. We first of all should open a terminal or a command prompt, and then we can install Sass by using the gem command, which should be available once you got Ruby installed. So let's do that real quick. I did open my Mac terminal here. Again, you would execute the same command on Windows, and now you run gem, and then it's install Sass. So gem install Sass. This will install that Sass tool which we need. Now this can take a couple of seconds, so let's wait for this to finish. And what you might get is a permission error on Mac. In this case, you should write sudo gem install Sass and you will be prompted to enter your password thereafter, but this will now grant the right permissions so that you can actually successfully install it. So now let's wait for this to finish, and once it's finished, we're already ready to write our Sass code and use that tool. Now on Mac, you also might get another error where it says that the installation failed to build gem native extension. You then need to run xcode -select --install. This uses Xcode, the developer tools by Apple, and you will be prompted in a new window then. Simply click install there and agree to the agreements. And this will now simply download a certain tool set from the official developer tools Apple provides, which are needed behind the scenes to compile that successfully. So once this is done, we can go back to the terminal, and then you should be able to successfully install Sass. So let's try this command again now, the sudo gem install Sass command. And now this looks much better. You can confirm that it was installed successfully by running sass-v here. And it should give you the latest Sass version you just installed. Now with that, you're ready to write Sass code. And for that, I'll switch back in our project. Now to be precise, attached to this video, you find a little starting project. If you open this by double-clicking the index.html file, you will see this. These links work, by the way, so definitely feel free to dive deeper into this after this module. So this is a normal page styled with normal CSS, split across two files, though I will admit the second file is not that big, but you will see why that is useful or why this is interesting. So this is the CSS code, and obviously there's nothing wrong with it, but we can already notice some things that can be improved, and hopefully Sass can help us there. So let's quickly identify these areas of improvement, and let's then dive into Sass. So what can be improved about this page? There are a couple of things. For example, here I'm using vendor prefixes. Nothing wrong with that, but I used them again a little bit further down. Here. Would be nice if we could outsource something like this, if we could put this into some reusable code that we could just insert here, and which then would be compiled to, well, the code we wrote here. Additionally, we got some nesting going on. Here, for the documentation links, we got a couple of nested selectors, and of course there's nothing wrong with this either, but writing it like this is not as easy to see as if we could write it something like this. Documentation link inside here. Now this is not supported in CSS, but Sass will support it, as you'll learn, and this will of course be easier. The color code, this is something else. We use the same color code a couple of times on this page here, as you can see. And obviously this also is okay, but if we ever decide to change the color, we have to change it everywhere manually. So it would be nice if we could reuse that too. And these are just some of the things. We will dive into some Sass features in this module, and you will see how we can shorten this code and make it easier to maintain. Now with that, it's time to write our first Sass code, and we'll do just that in the next lecture. So time to write our first Sass code. And for that, I'll create a new file and I'll name it main.sass. And now in this file we can, well, surprisingly, write Sass code. Now let's start simple. And let's not even use a Sass feature, let's just try to replicate our CSS code with Sass. And for that, I'll copy all the code from the main.css file and put it into that Sass file. And now you see a bunch of errors. All the semicolons are marked as red and all the curly braces. The reason for this is that Sass actually works without semicolons and without braces. Instead, indentation is used to determine to which selector a certain property belongs. So if we were to convert this code to valid Sass code, we would remove all the semicolons and we would remove all the curly braces here, like that. This is valid Sass code now. And if we would remove the indentation, this would be invalid because the indentation here really now decides to which selector this property belongs. If it's indented one level, it belongs to the selector above this level, so to say. So this is how we would convert our code. Now, you might like this or you may not like this. This is really something which differs from person to person. Most people find SCSS a bit easier though. It uses the same features as Sass does, but it actually keeps the CSS syntax with the semicolons and the curly braces. So I will revert my deletions here and add all these semicolons and curly braces back in, and I'll rename that file here to .scss at the end, not Sass. Now we can actually keep our code as it was before. Just need to add a semicolon after the import here. And now we can continue working here. So this is the syntax I will use, and this now looks like CSS, and actually normal CSS also is valid as CSS, so we could leave it like this, but now we can add more features to that file. Now let's already add one feature so that I can also show you how this compilation step works. And that one feature I want to add is nesting. So if we scroll down a bit, we see that, for example, for documentation links, we nest the list item, we nest documentation link, and we nest documentation link hover and active. So what we can now do is, we can go to documentation links and simply add another selector nested into this selector, so next to the other properties. With normal CSS, this would not be possible, but now this will actually be converted to this syntax here. So I will now grab the code I had in there and put it into this nested li. And now we can nest this even more. So I will grab this code for the documentation link and add it next to the li. Actually, I could also add it inside of the li, since, as you can see on the index.html file, documentation link is a class on an element nested in the li. But both will work here, of course, because documentation link is also nested in documentation links, even though it's no direct child. But that also doesn't have to be the case. This really is just a translation of this syntax here. And that, of course, means we can also grab the hover and active links and copy that into our code. So we can go up and add that selector here, get rid of that documentation links, so that now we got this nested code. Now I can get rid of documentation links li and this, so all the code we just nested. And you can already see how this makes the code a bit more readable, because here we're now containing all the styles related to my documentation links in one big selector, so to say. Now, how do we turn this into normal CSS though? Because this would not run. We need the command line, the terminal for that. And here I will open the terminal which is integrated into Visual Studio Code, but you can also use the normal Mac or Windows terminal we used before. Just make sure that you navigate into this project folder. Then you can use the Sass command, which is available since we installed Sass with the gem command earlier. And now you can run sass main.scss, so you target the file which holds your Sass code, and then you define a file name for the file you want to generate. And here I will use main.css, hence I will override the original .css file. If I hit enter, this will now generate the main.css file. It also gives us a map file, which is a source map file, which makes it easier for the browser to map our code to the original source code, but we don't have to worry about that right now. In the new main.css file, though, you can see that instead it automatically created these nestings we had in there before. So we get the same code as before, but now generated automatically by the sass command. And if you don't want to rerun this command whenever you make a change in your .scss file, then you can also enter sass-watch main.scss, so the file you want to watch for changes, and then colon, and then immediately without a white space, main.css. Now this will enter watch mode, and as you see, this is now an ongoing process which you can quit with Ctrl+C. And now whenever we change something in that file and save that file, it will automatically recompile. So if I quickly set the background here to black, for example, just to see a difference, and I save this, you see it detected a change and recreated the file. And if we go back and reload, we see that new style. Now I will switch this back, but this is now really useful to ensure that we don't have to manually compile all the time. So with that, we see how we can use Sass, and we already learned about the first feature, the nesting of selectors. Now let's see what else we can do with Sass. I actually gave you a brief overview over the most important features here in all these links. We had a look at nested rules or selectors in the last video. Now let's have a look at nested properties. Now what are nested properties? Let's go up a bit. Here in the container class, I'm still in the main.scss file by the way, there you see we got two properties from the flex namespace, flex direction and flex wrap. Obviously we're not dying if we have to write this manually. But what we actually can also do now is we can type flex like this, and now add curly braces, and now add direction column and wrap no wrap like this. This allows us to remove these two lines here, and behind the scenes, if we save this and we have a look at the created file and we scroll up to the container, you see it still generated the code we had there before. These are nested properties if they're from the same namespace. So if they start with the same part here, flex dash, font dash, and so on, you can just use that namespace without the dash and then nest all the nested properties in there. So this is a quick and nice way of also keeping your properties together. Okay, the last one was a quick one. Nested properties can be really useful. Super useful are variables though. Now what are variables? Now variables allow us to define a certain value and reuse it throughout our code. For example, that color here. This color, this exact color, is getting used a lot, as you can see. Here, we use it quite a lot in our code. Now if we define it like this and we ever decide that we want to use a different color, we have to go to all these places in our code and manually adjust it, which is not super comfortable. So what we can do, typically at the top of the file, we can define a so-called variable, a feature which is also available in next-gen CSS. You learned about CSS variables already, but which is also available here in SCSS. And when using variables in SCSS, you of course have the great benefit that it will be compiled to code which does not use CSS variables, so which will run in all browsers and not just in more recent ones. So this is a great way of using variables without having to support cutting-edge browsers only. You define a variable by adding a $sign, that always has to be the first character, and then the name of your variable, maybe main color. And then you simply add a colon and the value you want to store. In my case, the hex code, 521751. That is the color we're using everywhere. Now with this saved here, we can use that variable in our file. Now, by the way, you can in general store as a value here for the variable what you can use as a value in CSS. So you could also store center or something like 1 rem, whatever you plan to do with that variable. Now in my case here I want to use a color, so I will store a color. Now we can grab that variable name, including the $sign, and replace all the hex code usages here in our SCSS file with that variable name. And when this gets compiled, this will simply get replaced with the value of our variable. Again, whichever value that would be. Of course, the value stored should fit to the properties you're using the variable on. So with that, if we save this and we reload our page, we see the same as before. And if we have a look at the compiled code, we also see that the color code is in there, which is exactly what should be the case. It doesn't use variables in the CSS file. It uses the real value. It just replaces our variables with that value we stored in there. So this can be thought of as a placeholder, so to say. And that, of course, is great because it's downward compatible. But actually on our page, we can do more with variables. There are more things we're reusing. And you can not just store single values in a variable, you can also store lists or maps in variables. So let's have a look at that in the next lecture. So what are lists and maps? Well, let me introduce you to this. A list simply is a variable that holds more than one value. A typical example would be something like the box shadow here. This is a list of values. It's not just one value, it's a list of values. And of course, we could store each value individually in a variable and then construct this from multiple variables. But it's easier if we just store this. So here we're not actually reusing the box shadow. Maybe we find another example where we are reusing it. An example would be the border. This border definition with 0.05 rem solid and the main color, we use that twice. So let's grab that value here and create a new variable which I'll name border default. And now I just put the value in there. Now, as I mentioned, you can basically put anything you find on the right side of a colon into a variable, but this officially is named a list because it's more than one value. We can now grab that border default variable and use it wherever we used that setup. So here for that border in Sass introduction and also for that border in the Sass details here. There also is one more border at the bottom for documentation link. So now we're using that border default variable everywhere. And as you can also see, you can also use variables in variables. We're using the main color variable in the border default variable. And if you save this and you reload your page, you again see no changes because this was replaced correctly. As you can see, if you check out the main.css file, there you see the border was replaced with the value you stored here. This, however, is called a list. Another list would, for example, be the font family. So a list is not just something where you have white spaces as separators. If you use a comma as seen here, this also would be a list you could store in a variable. Now we could do that for this setup, but since we're not reusing this, it doesn't really matter if we stored it in a variable or not, but you could do this. This is also called a list. Now on the link here, you actually see lists and maps though. So what is a map then? Well, a map is simply a list where each item has a name by which you can access it. Now, what does this mean? Let's add a new variable, which I'll name colors. Because let's say we got a couple of different colors in our app, as we actually do. We do have that purple color, but if you scroll down, you also see, for example, that orange color which we use. And there is one additional color which I won't put into the map though. Now, I already mentioned it. I want to create a map of colors. Obviously, we could use main color, we could use secondary color, and we could store all these colors in variables, and there would be nothing wrong with that. But sometimes you want to have more structure and you want to group your variables. A map allows you to do that. A map is constructed by adding parentheses, first of all. That is how you simply start a new map. In the parentheses, you now create key value pairs by first of all defining a key, so a name of your choice, like main. Could name it main color, but we're already in the colors map, so it's clear that this is a color. So main is the key, then you add a colon, and then the value of the key. And you add more key value pairs by adding a comma and then adding secondary, and now that would be the orange color. With that, we can actually comment out the main color. And by the way, you can now see that you can use 2 forward slashes as comments. This would not be possible in normal CSS, but Sass allows you this commenting syntax. And now we can use our color map to, well, set our values. The question just is, how do we get this value or these values out of the map? For example, in all the places where we did use main color before, like here in the border default variable definition. It's simple. Sass also has a couple of built-in functions, one of them being map get, which allows you to get a value from, well, a Sass map. There you first of all pass the name of the map, which is colors in our case, and then the name of the key you want to get, in our case, main. If you now save this, you of course get an error because we got a couple of other places in the app where we're still trying to access main color. So let's copy that map get syntax and add it there. So in all the places where we're using main color, we want to use that map get function now to instead extract our color from our color map. Let's also do it for the orange color here. There we have to reference secondary though. And now with that, if we save this again, it should successfully compile. If we check out the compiled file here, we can also see that it now still uses our colors correctly, also the orange color down there. And if we reload our page, this also looks unchanged. But now we're organizing our code a bit more efficient by using a map for our colors. Hence, we're grouping these values according to their function, which makes a lot of sense, I guess, and by using normal variables, or actually a list variable here too. So these were lists, variables in general, and maps. And as you can see, this allows you to save a lot of code because you simply can define it here, and then you use these variables, and if you ever want to change something, you change it here once, and you're good to continue. We already had a look at a lot of important Sass features until now. Let's now have a look at some built-in functions. Actually, we saw one in the last video. Map get is a function provided by Sass to extract the value from a map, but there are more. And you can click that link here to find a list of all the functions Sass ships with. These are a couple of functions you already know from CSS, like RGB, but then also new ones like red, to just get the red component of a color you pass as a value. Now, to be honest, all these color functions as well as opacity functions are really interesting. So let me show you where you could benefit from using them. Back in our project, there is one line in our code, here, where I got a very light purple in the Sass introduction. Now, of course, I can select this manually, but the downside again is that if I ever change my main color here, this brighter version of it might not fit it anymore. Of course, I could define it up here too and always change it when I change this, but sometimes you just want to have this color depend on your main color and just create a brighter, a lighter version of your main color. So what we can do is we can use a function for this. We can go here, where we use the background, and use the lighten function like this. That is also a function provided by Sass. The first argument here is a color, so we can use map get again to get our main color. The second argument is the amount by which you want to lighten it. And if you have a look at the official docs here, you see that lighten here takes an amount between 0 and 100%. So we can lighten this by, let's say, 70%. And now if I save this and I go back to my page here, you see the color up here slightly changed. It's a bit too dark. Let's ramp this up to 80%. And now it's way too light, so maybe the truth is somewhere between 72% maybe. If we do that, that looks good. Now we can copy that code here and also use it in the second place where we use the lighter color. And now the advantage really is that we're using this color all the time, or this function, and hence if we ever change the main color, this will also adjust. For example, if we were to decide that our main color should be black, well then the background would also adjust to a gray. So that is where this really shines and where this really helps us. Now, with that, we saw how we can use built-in functions. As you of course saw on the link I just showed you, there are way more functions, so definitely just dive into that function reference here and play around with them to see what you can do with that, what can be useful for you, and what can speed up your next project creation process. So we already had a look at quite a lot of Sass functionalities. We worked a lot with variables, and there's one thing which might have come to your head, to your mind. We got our size default and size tiny, which we use quite a bit. But we also got cases where we have 3 rem, 2 rem. So multiples of our sizes, you could say. Of course, we could define separate variables for these, and if we were to reuse these values a lot, that would make sense. But if we just have some usages, what we could do, and what is supported by Sass, is simple arithmetic. We could use size default here, which is 1 rem, and simply multiply it by 3. If we now save this and we have a look at the created main.css file, you see that we still get 3 rem here, because Sass is able to do simple math like this: multiplication, division, subtraction, and addition. You can do it with variables. You can also do it with other values. Details about this can be found in the official Sass documentation. The cool thing is, now this padding also depends on our default size, even though it's not the same value, but it's a multiple of it. The same for this padding. There we could also use size default times 2. For the box shadow here, for example, we could use size tiny divided by 2, since we used half of it. And so on. This is what you can do in your code in general. Here, for that margin, size default times 2, for example. Here for border bottom, we could use size tiny divided by 4, since we used a fourth of our tiny size, which is .2. With that in place, we can save. And now again, in the main.css file, you will see the same values as before, and if you reload the page, you see the same as before. But if you go back to main.scss and you ever change your default size to 2, you will see that your entire page adjusts now, because we in general increased all these multiples too. So that now takes it one step further to a really reusable and flexible page with the help of Sass. Now we had a look at operators and variables and so on. Let's now dive into better imports and partials in this video. What does this mean? We already got an import in place, pointing to a CSS file. And if you import from a CSS, not a .scss or Sass file, then Sass will leave this import as it is. If you check out the compiled file, you see it wrapped it in this URL function provided by default CSS, but it still works like default CSS. And let's have a look at how this import works. If we open the developer tools on our page, and we go to the network tab there, and reload the page, you see we got 3 requests: the index.html file, and then main CSS and the typography file. This is how it works. These are simply requested because we're importing typography in the main.css file. Now sometimes you want to generate one big CSS file, but still split it up during development, so that you have an easier time managing it, but still that you can, well, spit out one big file. And for our case here, this would make sense, because in typography, we're again using our color. So it would be nice if we could also use our variables in there. So for that, I will create a so-called partial. Now, a partial starts with an underscore in the file name, and then you can name it whatever you want. Here I'll name it variables.scss. The idea behind a partial is that you can include it in many other files, and behind the scenes, Sass will ensure that it only gets included once, or that its values are only used once. So what we can do now is, we can go back to the main.scss file, and take all our variables we have in there and put them into our variables partial file. Now we just need to import from that file to make sure that our code works again. So back in the main.css file, we again add an import statement, and now we import from variables.scss like this. If you save this, it successfully compiles the main.css file again. It also successfully uses our colors and the other variables, so this seems to work. But you don't see the import statement pointing to the variables.scss file, because it only included this during the compilation step, looked up the values, and took it into account whilst compiling our code, but it didn't add it. How would have added this anyways? These variables are not supported by normal CSS. So we're using a partial, and we can also use this in the typography file, of course. Let's copy the import statement from the main.scss file. Let's add it to our typography file here, like this. And let's also now use our map then. So map get, and now it's the colors map and the main color. Now this is not supported by the editor because this still is a CSS file. We should turn it into a SCSS file too. So now we turn this into a SCSS file, which is now also using our variables. What we can now do is we can save that file, go back to the main.scss file and adjust this import too, and import the typography.scss file. If we save this and we go back to the main CSS, you now see something different. Now there no longer is an import statement, but instead the code from the typography file was simply copied into the main.css file. And the values from the colors were replaced because it still understands this import here in the typography file. So now we only have one big file, and as a developer, we still work with multiple files, which is typically what we want because it makes our life easier. If we go back to the running page and we reload it, we no longer see the typography request here hence, because this is now included in the main.css file. So this is a cool way of creating one file, which leads to less HTTP requests to be made, whilst still ensuring that we have a comfortable way working with these files. Because we still work with our files, we now even have a separate file for the variables, but we get one file as a result. And this is with the help of partials for the variables file and the better import statement, which will actually include the content, as it does here for this import, instead of really making a separate request. With partials and better import out of the way, let's move on to advanced media. Now what is that about? What does this mean? We obviously have media queries in normal CSS too, and we got one at the bottom of our file here. It just changes some sizes here. Now, media queries can still be used like this. Nothing wrong with that. Now, of course, you can also use Sass features like variables or nested selectors in here if you wanted to do that. This is all normal Sass code in the end. But you can also write your media queries a bit differently if you want. You can take that media query code here, let's say for the HTML element, and go up to the HTML element and actually nest the media query now. Now what you can do is you can get rid of that selector, since you already nested the media query in that selector, and of the first curly brace, and just keep the closing curly brace of the media query. And now if you save that, what this will do is it will still generate a separate media query, so valid CSS code, which nests this HTML rule, but you as a developer have this convenient way of keeping your media queries close to the elements which they affect. You don't have to use it. You can still use the other approach of collecting all your elements that should go into a single media query. But this is a way you might like because it's, well, keeping your code closer to where you use it. So if I also do that for a Sass introduction here, I'll cut the entire media query, go to my Sass introduction and add it here, get rid of the HTML part, get rid of the selectors here, and reformat this. And now I can also copy that over to details, where I also wanted to use that. Now I got this restructured and maybe a bit more readable to us as a developer, because the media query is always sitting on the element which it affects. And again, behind the scenes, this is compiled to code like this. If we go back to our running application and we reload it, we shouldn't see a difference because it still leads to the same code, it just is a bit more readable to us. Again, this is only an option, you don't have to use it, but you can use it if you want to. Now that we learned how we can improve our code with the easier media queries, let's have a look at inheritance and what this actually means. Inheritance means that if you got a certain rule set for a given selector, which you also want to use on a different selector, then you can simply inherit from this selector. Let me show you how this works. If you have a look at 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 and 𝗧𝗜𝗘, they're very similar. Both have a border default, both have this background color, both have this padding, both have text align center, both have the width and the box sizing. Only the box shadow on the 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 is a difference. And on 𝗧𝗜𝗘, we got that margin. So what we could do is, we could create a new class, of course, which we simply name 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘, where we group all these shared features. So the text alignment and so on, and then the width and the box sizing. And also the media query, which is the same. Like this. Now 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 is just a box shadow. 𝗧𝗜𝗘 also can get rid of the first 4 properties. We'll leave the margin, but we can get rid of the rest. For this to work correctly, we now just need to ensure that we also add 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 to the places where we use 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 and 𝗧𝗜𝗘. So let's go back to the index.html file, and let's actually add 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 to the section class or the section with the class 𝗧𝗜𝗘 and to the one with 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘. If we save all files and we reload the page, we should get the same result as before. However, this now meant that we had to add both classes here. This is a bit error prone since we can't forget this. So let's remove this actually, and let's go back to main.scss. So an easier way we can use when using 𝗧 is we can inherit from this 𝗧 section class. This is done by using the @extend directive, as it is called. This is not a normal CSS feature, but a 𝗧 only feature. And here we simply define a class from which we want to inherit. In our case, 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘, like this. We do the same in 𝗧𝗜𝗘, and if you save this and reload, you again get the same result as before, even though, keep in mind, we removed the 𝗧 section here. The reason is that inheritance did the following for us. It created this new rule set, where 𝗧 section, 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘, and 𝗧𝗜𝗘 share the same set of common rules. And then we got our more specialized sets of rules for 𝗧𝗜𝗠𝗘 and 𝗧𝗜𝗘. Now you can do more with inheritance, and you can read all about that by clicking on that inheritance link here. But this is of course a very cool feature that ensures that you can easily set up shared styles and use or add them to any other classes you got without manually having to take care that you implement that shared class in your HTML code. Instead, you keep your specialized classes and simply let 𝗧 do the rest. So we had a look at inheritance in the last video, a very useful feature that also saves us time when writing more complex code. Let's now have a look at mix-ins. This will be the last thing I want to show you, but this is a really cool feature that also allows you to save code. Now, what are mix-ins? Mix-ins are reusable custom functions, if you want to put it like this. You already got functions like map_get or lighten, which do utility things for you, and mix-ins are really your own functions you can write. They are super useful whenever you want to, for example, put some code which you commonly use into such a function, so that you just have to include your mix-in function in that place and then enter that code you outsourced. Well, that sounds super complicated, doesn't it? So let's see that in action. For example here, We got our display property in the container, and we got that again further down in the documentation links class. Since I use vendor prefixes here, we got the same code 4 times. So we got the 4 display properties here. Now we can put this into a mixin. A mixin is created by using the @mixin directive provided by Sass. This is not a CSS feature. Then you define any name you want, like maybe display-flex. But again, it's up to you how you name this. Thereafter, you add parentheses, and you could accept arguments here. I'll show an example for this in a second too. For now, we'll use this without arguments. And then you simply add the code which you want to print out whenever you use that mixin. In our case, that display flex code. So I'll cut it from the container and put it into the mixin, just like that. No selector, nothing like that. It's just added between the curly braces. Now we can use that mixin in all the places where we want to enter this code. So we go back to the container, and there you now don't just put it in like this, but instead you add @include, another directive provided by Sass. @include then takes the mixin you want to use, and don't forget the parentheses. Now with this line, this code which is placed in the directive, in the mixin I should say, will be added in this place here, so in the container. Now I can copy that and add it in the other place where I want to use that same code. So down here in documentation links. If we now save this and let it recompile and we reload the page, you again see no difference because it works as before. But if you have a look at the compiled code here, you can actually see that this display code is entered correctly, so that mixin is used. And that of course is super useful because with that now we can put code snippets, which we use quite a lot, into their own, well, mixins. Now another thing we could put into a mixin is our media query here. So we could add another mixin with @mixin and name this media-min-width. And now here I actually want to put that media query like this. Now we got 2 problems with that mixin. We hard-coded the min-width, and for this application this would even be fine because we always use 40 rem, but it would be nicer if we could accept this as an argument to have a truly reusable mixin here. So this can be fixed by simply accepting an argument. You name this with a $sign at the beginning and then any name of your choice, like width. And then you simply use that variable, which is now only available within the mixin, in all the places where you want to use that width, like this. So now we're creating a mixin where we can actually pass in different widths. And the only thing that is shared amongst all the mixins is the min-width condition here, which is exactly what I want to have here. We got one other problem though. We got the font size hard-coded in here. And not in all places where we use the media query, we want to set the font size. And that's even the case for our application. For example, we also set the width. So we somehow need to tweak this a little bit to not just accept an argument which gives us the width, the minimum width we set, but to also be able to pass in the actual content of the media query from outside. Now, how would that work? Inside of your mixin, you can simply add another directive, @content, like this. This now allows you to use the mixin a bit differently and pass in dynamic content. You would now use it by going to the place where you want to use it, using @include as before, then the mixin name, media-min-width, then I would pass the width here, but then I would add curly braces thereafter, and again add the content which should be injected into the mixin. So this would translate to this code being added, but the font size here would be placed in this @contents place here. And the width passed as an argument would be used here in the min-width condition. If I save this and we have a look at the compiled file, we can see just that. We got that media query where we set the font size. Behind the scenes though, in our Sass code, we use our mixin. So now I can copy that code here, @include media-min-width with the 40 rem, and use it anywhere where I want to use that mixin, but I will swap out the content with the actual content I want to use in that place. Like in this case here, the width, and let's see if we got another media query. No, these seem to be all. With that, we can save this again, and if we reload this page again, still no changes. I guess from this part, this is a really boring section, isn't it? But it's really interesting to learn how you can use mixins, both in a simpler form or with arguments and even a content hook to create really reusable code snippets. And with that, we got much leaner code. Now again, for mixins, just as for the inheritance, you can dive in much deeper, and you should simply click this link here to learn more about mixins. So throughout this module, we learned a lot about Sass. Now looking over our code, there are still some things we can improve, or things that look like they could still be improved. For one, I forgot that here, this h1 tag, we could nest this into the section header to be in line with our other logic where we also use nesting when possible. And the same here for the paragraph in the Sass introduction. This also can be nested in here. And if you already did this earlier in this module, for example in the assignment, good job. This is more nesting done. But what else can we do? Let's have a look at this hover and active thing. Doesn't this look a bit strange? We got all these nice improvements in place, and still here it looks like we still have to manually create this group of selectors, which is the same selector as here, just with a pseudo selector added. Well, we can handle this with Sass too. Now, the first thought might be that you can nest this, so that you can add hover and active like this in your selector, or in the documentation link selector. Now, if you do that, and you reload your page, you'll see that hovering has no effect anymore. Let's check out the created CSS code. There you see that actually what it did is it created this, obviously, as nested selectors. So if we had other elements which are hoverable or active inside our documentation link, then these styles would get applied to these elements. But we don't have them, so this doesn't work here. Instead, what we want to do is we want to apply hover and active to the documentation link, not nested to it. Now, how do we do that? For this, Sass has the and, the ampersand operator. We add it in front of :hover and :active, and then we still keep it nested in documentation link. This tells Sass that these pseudo selectors here, and this does not only work with pseudo selectors, you could also have a normal class here, for example, that they should be connected to the element here rather than nested inside of it. So if we compile this and we go back to the main.css file, you see that the rule changed, and now it changed to documentation link with the hover effect or with active. So now we have this connected selector here. And now with that, if we reload the page, it works again, and now we can hover again. So this was one final improvement I wanted to put into place, because now we got a really optimized and nice looking SCSS file where we take advantage of the many features Sass gives us. So throughout this module, we had a look at a lot of Sass features in our code here. You learned about variables, nesting, mix-ins, partials, the different import syntax, and so on. Now, I can only encourage you to dive deeper into the topics which are linked in this project, as well as simply on the official Sass page. There you can learn more about Sass and more about how you can use it and add it to your workflow. And that's also important. You not always use the Sass command line tool as we did here. In a lot of projects where you use Webpack anyways, for example, you can implement Sass loader. And that is now really beyond the scope of this module here, but you can implement tools that integrate with Webpack that will do that Sass compilation as part of your regular build workflow. So this is also available. You don't have to use the Sass command line tool we used here. But it's a great place to get started, and I want to encourage you to keep on practicing Sass and playing around with it, since this really is a more fun way of creating CSS, at least for a lot of people, including myself.